The question is intentionally rhetorical. Like, what the fuck happened in 1971? We're not asking because we know what happened in 1971, but do you?
To suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold, to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
But the French led the way, and they said, we've had enough. We're getting your dollars, but we don't like them, and we want our gold.
Des dollars, au même titre que de l'or, entraînent les Américains à s'endetter et à s'endetter gratuitement.
And that's when Nixon put his foot down, and the saying was he closed the gold window, no more gold would come out. In a way, it's a declaration of bankruptcy that we can't, defend our position and pay our bills, and yet we've been borrowing the money and we've been fooling the people, and we've continued this process.
Once I knew my stocks and bonds were gone, I knew Satoshi Nakamoto was the...
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. To lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. It's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
You've been printing money.
Well, effectively, and we need to do that because our economy is very weak.
Don't panic, the price will rise and fall. Ultimately, we're breaking through the wall. Sky's the limit, and I'm in it to win it. So I'm just holding for the longest time.
Somebody asked me, what is the Federal Reserve System? And you've got 30 seconds to explain it. I can say, well, I don't need 30 seconds. I can do it in 4. The Federal Reserve System is a scam. Any questions? If you have the courage to read the Federal Reserve Act, you talk about boring, but it's all in there. The United States Congress passed a law which in essence was a cartel agreement for all the major banks to come together and share the market and control the market to their advantage.
The constitutional dollar is defined as a weight of gold or silver. The genius of the Federal Reserve Plan was it inserted a man in the middle in 1913 between the Constitution and the people in the form of the Federal Reserve. And that was the introduction of the Fed dollar. It's not the dollar that is defined by the Constitution. It's a note that's issued by the Federal Reserve.
The power to actually print the money is the basis for the whole inflationary system. Doesn't mean they actually print the money and spend it. That's what the Treasury used to do in the Civil War. But it's a more sophisticated way of doing it. They write out checks out of thin air, buy bonds with it, and then the checks or the deposits on the Fed then go out into the system.
Now that we have the Federal Reserve System, now that we have a means of creating money ourselves, creating money, the purpose of tax has become very narrow. We can fund everything we want to do simply by creating the money. We still need the tax primarily as a social mechanism, as a means of engineering society, as a means of control. That's what they have the taxes for.
Before every election, our representatives would like to make us think we're getting a tax break. And they're able to do it while at the same time actually raising our taxes because of a bit of magic they have in their kit bag. That magic is inflation. They reduce the tax rates, but the taxes we have to pay go up because we are automatically shoved into higher brackets by the effect of inflation. A neat trick, taxation without representation.
It's true that the money supply inflates. And so they think, well, the prices are going up. But in reality, it's just that the value of the dollar goes down.
In 1971, they removed the final link between gold and the dollar, and then the value of the dollar plummeted. And that expressed itself in very high inflation. But of course, no government has ever admitted to messing around with its currency, and it's always the fault of everything else in the universe. Well, the oil crisis in the Middle East. But of course, none of that matters compared to the monetary cause of it. So the price of everything was rising because the value of the dollar was dropping, because they were printing dollars like crazy.
Throughout history, the only thing that has ever been discovered that stabilizes the purchasing power of money is a monetary system that's based on something that requires human effort to produce. Because human effort is the common denominator between goods and services on the one side and money on the other. If you don't have human effort on both sides of the equation, you don't have a real equation. It's not a mathematical equation, it's a social equation.
Free markets have been trying to zero in on absolute scarcity with whatever technology is available in the world historically. Like say it used to be seashells with a certain society for which seashells were rare, or the most scarce fungible thing. But as technology became more sophisticated, gold became that game theoretic backstop. Gold has the highest stock to flow ratio, has superior relative supply scarcity, all these things that basically caused it to outcompete all the other monetary metals and become global prime money, which it still is today. Central banks hold gold, they settle with finality in gold. People want to know that if I'm holding money, I'm holding something that's self-sovereign. It cannot be deauthorized, it cannot be reversed, it cannot be inflated. The asset that I hold, it has value as determined by the free market.
The way that inflation was fought was not by reducing the printing of money, which is the root cause, but by providing massive subsidies to agriculture to mass produce food at a very low cost. There's a guy called Earl Butz, and he was put in charge of the agricultural program in the US, and he was given the express mission of making more food and making food cheaper.
Earl Butz responded by calling upon American farmers to plant fence row to fence row, and he told them to get big or get out.
In order to make the food so cheap, it was very low on nutrients and very high on sugar and junk. People talk about, well, there's no inflation because look at the CPI, it's 2% or 3%, and that's just completely ridiculous. There was a time in the US where you could buy a ribeye steak for $1, and then you could buy a burger for $1, but now you can barely buy a soy burger patty for $1. So if you look at it, well, look, there's no inflation. As long as you don't mind the difference between a ribeye and a burger and a soy burger, and you're still paying $1 for your lunch.
Mr. Bernanke, if you don't mind, would you tell me whether or not you do your own shopping at the grocery store?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so you're aware of the prices. But this argument that the prices are going up about 2%, nobody believes it. And the old CPI says prices are going up at 9%. So they believe this. If people on fixed incomes, they're really hurting. The middle class is really hurting because their inflation rate is very much higher than the government tries to tell them. If you loan me $100 and in 2 years from now I gave you 90 back, you'd be pretty upset. It's theft. If I don't give you your full $100 back, if you loan me $100, I'm stealing $10 from you. So somebody's stealing wealth, and this is very upsetting. The Fed's going to self-destruct eventually anyway.
Fractional reserve banking is, in my view, is inherently bankrupt. I mean, it's always ready to go bust. The reason is fairly simple. Most businesses, or all businesses, as far as I know, try to have the time structure of their assets shorter than the time structure of their liabilities. To have the money flowing in before they have to pay the money out. With banks, however, just the opposite. Banks' liabilities are zero time structure. In other words, you have to pay immediately. I'm talking about demand deposits and banknotes. So all banks are inherently bankrupt. All of these for the public to find out about it. Essentially, it's a structure based on mythology more than anything else.
This is what I would like you to take away from this. Your money is safe at the banks. The last thing you should be doing is pulling your money out of the banks now, thinking that it's going to be safer someplace else. You don't want to be walking around with large wads of cash, and you certainly don't want to be hoarding cash in your mattress. It didn't pan out well for so many people. And I will tell you this, no depositor has lost a penny of their insured deposits since 1933, when the FDIC was created. So if you're talking about having your money in a safe place, please keep it in an FDIC-insured bank.
Going off the gold standard, and with the FDIC, the use of insurance, of course, is a euphemism. It means the government prints money and bails out the banks.
Wars are extremely expensive. All those troops and guns and fighter planes and drones and bombs have to be paid for. So how to raise the money to pay for them? One way the government does this is through taxes. The government just takes the money from the people.
Now all of a sudden you have to issue war bonds, and people have to get behind the idea and fund it.
Get 'em, folks. Come on, skip right up and get 'em. Any bonds today? Bonds of freedom, that's what I'm selling. Any bonds today? Scrape up the most you can. Here comes the freedom man, asking you to buy a share of freedom today.
At a certain point, even the most pig-headed, rah-rah war lover will snap out of beast mode when he realizes the government is taxing him and his family into poverty to fund the war. So the government has a challenge. Is there a way for it to take the wealth of the people without them knowing it?
Well, with a fiat currency, you can just debase the currency immediately without any of the citizens having a vote to pay for the war.
Throughout history, statism has been imposed by an alliance of two groups. The state itself, the state apparatus, the king, the throne, and the opinion molding groups, the intellectuals, which in most cases in history have been the churches. And so this is known as the alliance of throne and altar. You have the church and the state. The function of the church was to tell the people to obey the state. The state is God in many cases. The king is God, and the public believes them because they're the intellectual opinion molders. And in return for that, the church gets part of the boodle. They get part of the state revenue in the form of tax, subsidies, and so forth. In the early 20th century, you begin to reform the old alliance of intellectuals and government. Big government intellectuals perform the function of court apologists for the new regime.
It is a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage.
What gold means, and this is something that Keynes was incapable of understanding because he never studied economics. It's not because it's yellow and shiny, and it's not because any of these things that he thought about it. What gold means is that economic value can only be acquired by creating value to others. And that's why in a hard money society everybody ends up working, doing productive things, because that's how you earn money, and that's the only way that you can make wealth. The alternative is that you have money that's easy to make, and central banks are able to make that, and they can make large quantities of it whenever they want. One section of society, government and people in government and people in the central bank, are able to effectively allocate value and wealth and economic resources, whereas everybody else has to work for it and earn it. And that's essentially a system of enslavement.
Breaking the dollar's peg to gold actually broke the intellectual character of our academic institutions. They're just no longer in reality. Keynesian economics reports that you can just print your way out of everything and government is omnipotent. Like in your textbooks, government is God. Just they don't suffer any opportunity costs, they can print money at will, they can change laws at will. It's a true delusion that we're living under.
Keynesian theories have made the subject of money feel so arcane to people that they feel like they just can't understand and they don't even want to try. And these ideas are not new. It's just that before Keynesian ideology was at the forefront, they didn't call it inflation, they just called it coin clipping or theft.
Overall, if you compare societies, when periods when money is expected to hold on its value, that will incentivize people to start thinking of the long term. The reason to hold money is to provide for the future, and the better the money is at holding its value for the future, the less uncertainty you have about the future, the more likely you are to think of the future, to account for the future, to provide for the future. And this is an economic decision, but it also reflects on all kinds of personal decisions. You look at savings rates since 1970 in the West, they've collapsed down to zero roughly. People don't really save anymore. In the 20th century, the silly statistic that people have obsessed about is consumption. It's just we need to get people consuming more. If we consume more, then GDP is up, and then numbers are up, and if numbers are up, then everybody's happy and people get reelected. And so we've had this fixation of getting people to spend more, thinking of the level of spending as being the level of health, and that's just insane. If you sell your house and sell all of your stuff, sell all of your capital, sell your business, you can get your consumption up this month higher than it has ever been and spend it all on a big massive party. Consumption numbers have gone up, you're rich. But, what are you going to do next month? This is the incentive structure that fiat money and government supervision of the economy has incentivized. So you get these incentives that are rational, really, in this monetary system. It makes no sense to save money when your money is going to lose its value. Everybody borrows for their car, their home, their wedding. All of your major expenses you borrow in order to fulfill them.
Do you have money jitters? Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
Under a gold standard, it was different. People would save up money all their life. As a child, you get born and you get given some money and you keep accumulating it. And then when you have a major expense, you bought it from your savings. In the current economy, money is the monetization of debt. Every time a bank issues a new loan, new money is being created, and so the money supply is being increased. And that's why this economy is so addicted to debt, because the institutions that issue debt are effectively printing new money. And therefore, you finance yourself from debt. And so now it makes sense to spend the money that you have to borrow and to pay off the debt because the money is losing its value.
We find a typical home occupied by a typical American family. Like millions of his fellow Americans, John Q. Public earns enough money to keep up the payments on a new car. He takes great pride in owning a fine, new, long-term mortgaged home that was built to last a lifetime.
When people have a low time preference, they're able to engage in long-term projects. When people have a high time preference, they can only think in terms of immediate gratification. And I think if you look at culture and art over the different periods, I think it's really hard to dismiss this. People like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and the masterpieces that they used to create when gold was money, you don't see things like that today. When you think about who are the major artists of the world today, but a bunch of idiots drawing a bunch of nonsense on a bunch of mattress that requires the level of skill that a 5-year-old could do. The entire freaking masterpiece takes 15 minutes to finish and then gets sold for $50 million. And then you look at Renaissance art, and every single one of those pictures took years of skill and mastery for the artist to be able to arrive at that. I don't think it's a coincidence that eras of unsound money produce this kind of degenerate art. People in this sort of society are unable to plan for the future and unable to think of the future. You can also see this with architecture. If you look around pretty much anywhere you travel in the world, the nice buildings were the ones that were built in the 19th century. And then the 20th century was the century of ugly industrial cookie cutter boxes that cram the cities and traffic jams and ugly highways. The city's been destroyed by central planning, by high time preference government policies, and people's inability to think about the long term.
People don't like taxes. They see a clear connection between government expenditures and taxes. Let's say the government says, let's increase public pensions. To finance this, we just increase income tax. Many people that are wage earners will probably not like it very much, but if the government increases public pension and then finances this by issuing bonds, these bonds are then monetized. That is, the money supply is increased to buy these bonds, and then prices increase a little bit, then people will probably not make the connection.
Everyone, whether in the factory, shop, farm, or office, pays for the cost of government.
If there's economic growth, prices would actually fall. If the government is increasing spending, this can compensate for the fall in prices that would have occurred due to increases in productivity. The internet, new technology, or the increase in the division of labor. Thanks to the increase in government spending and the new debt and the monetization of the debt, prices don't fall, but stay the same or increase a little bit. So then people at the gas station will not say, oh, today I pay the same for my gas like last year. But if the government would not have increased government spending, now I could pay 10% less. And the cost of the government spending, if it's financed through the printing press, is hidden. People just don't make the connection between the government expenditures, the deficit, the issue of government debt, and the increase in prices, or the prices that are higher than they otherwise would have been.
The Cantillon effect is when you print and central bankers are providing more fiat, more liquidity into the system. They're doing it via financial assets.
The people who are benefited are indeed wealthy, but it's not specifically the wealthy people. It's more people who are friends with the money printers make money off the people who are not friends with the money printers. Because when you inflate the money supply, it's not Bernanke's helicopter where it just drops $100 bills on everyone. Money is printed and first handed to a specific industry or group of people that the government, Federal Reserve, and commercial bankers choose. Those people, because they now have more money, they get to benefit from the fact that the rest of the economy has not adjusted its prices to that new amount of money. And then by time that ripples all the way to people like you and I, we have to just bear the brunt of the higher prices. And this is the thing about inflation. It's a wealth redistribution scheme. And you're taking from everybody else and giving it to yourself. There's something really wrong about that, right? You know, who are the people that you see saying silly things like hyperinflation is good for economies because it stops the concentration of wealth? They're the closest ones to the money spigot. They're the politicians, they're the intellectuals, the socialized intellectuals. Of course they have reason to perpetuate this nonsense.
I don't like to speak hyperbolically, but I find it hard not to call this the greatest con in human history. I mean, they've been stealing vast swaths of our time, energy, effort, wealth, just by tweaking the money supply.
And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever.
I call it monetary socialism. We as Americans pride ourselves on being free market capitalists, and will readily tell you that supply and demand should dictate the price of anything, right? Not a central planning authority for any commodity, any market in the world. But for some reason, we have this blind spot when it comes to the US dollar.
Stock prices jumped after the Federal Reserve dropped its discount rate. A slower rate of growth appears likely now that a tighter money policy has been confirmed by the Federal Reserve Chairman. The Federal Reserve approved the applications of 4 banks to offer some new financial services.
All they're doing is suppressing free market dynamics. The price of money is the interest rate. They're not letting the interest rate be naturally determined. Because a free market, it promulgates truth, right? In terms of the price, which is what does supply and demand say something is worth? And then what is the best tech for the job? So not only do we not know the price of money, they're not letting innovation occur.
When you are trying to play God and control the economy, the Fed is effectively like the wizard in the Wizard of Oz. Behind the curtain is just a person trying to pull all these levers because they believe that they know the economy and they can control the economy to their will.
You ungrateful creatures! Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain!
Now, this is an affront to what we know about what the economy really is. It's a very organic process, and it's a very complex process. Monetary policy is actually the cause of these business cycles. So they don't understand that when you're back there pulling all those levers, you're actually setting the stage for these business cycles. You are creating a much more fragile system, and this is where black swans will kill you.
They've been able to violently and coercively control this market, shut down any competing business, stifle innovation, put people in prison with legal tender laws. There's such high enforcement costs. For the same mathematical reasons that Soviet Russia imploded, monetary socialism or central banking will implode as well.
Gold was so interwoven into our society for such a good reason. It was the best money because of its hardness, but gold has severe flaws. It was its physical locality that required us to use paper and all these other devices in order to scale it, and that was what led to us abandoning gold.
Once you were using financial instruments that were backed by gold, it gave the people who run these payment and settlement network an enormous amount of power and leverage over the control of gold. Because it was much harder to keep track of how much gold there was, and people could issue more paper receipts than there is gold. You know, the temptation of taking over the central banks was too strong for governments. Governments took it over and then realized they could use it to finance wars. And since then, they have not been willing or able to give up the temptation of resorting to the printing press. The 20th century was the century of politicians, governments taking advantage of the printing press, voters being duped into thinking that this is a free lunch. There is something wrong with the gold standard, which is that governments can mess it up if they choose to. And it would be nice if we had something that was immune to the control of government.
It's conscious, you know, like they know that underneath it all is the fact that they can't steal from people if they have to have sound money. That they know they are limited in how much wealth they can confiscate from the average person. The very survival of what is the political status quo, the very survival of what we think of as the role of government in society depends on not having sound money. This is going to be some of the most crazy times to be alive, to see the unraveling of all of this. There is a fight coming. What do you think they would be willing to do to save the very idea of government authority to manipulate what we do, to bail out their cronies and to give subsidies and contracts to all of their biggest donors, to buy votes. You know, you won't have to work if things are tough. You don't have to produce. We'll pay you, and it's the evil producers that are keeping you poor. That sort of thing is the power to move the world. And when you've already shown that you're willing to use that power however seems convenient to you, they're not going to just roll over. We're moving into the digital age. That means that we will either get back our privacy through cryptography and independent protocols and systems, or we will by default lose it. Those are the only two options. Even if we go down the bad path, do you want to be one of the ones that said, yeah, I invested in this, and even though there was an alternative, I never supported it. I never saw that it was valuable. I don't know. That's not something I want to have to say.